July 1866, one of the wealthiest men in Victorian-era Britain was imprisoned here at York Castle after spending the last 7 years hopping between hotels in France, avoiding the British justice system. And what's so interesting is that all across this city you can still see reminders that tell this unbelievable story of fraud, and I'm going to show you them all. And this story actually involves Charles Dickens as well, so stick around. So, the new prisoner here was a man named George Hudson, and at one singular point in 1849, before he fled the country, he owed creditors over £80 million in today's money. He had embezzled millions upon millions from the companies that he was involved in, he'd overvalued his shares way above the market price, and he'd generated fictitious revenues, he'd classified expenses as investments, and even omitted some spending entirely. I mean, it was as if Hudson was trying to commit every variant of financial crime possible. But, as with all similar cases, at one point things looked perfect for dear George. He lived with his family at this grand townhouse on Monkgate. He served as Lord Mayor of York 3 times, and he served as MP for Sunderland for 15 years. But his power lay in the railways. From 1844, his nickname was the Railway King, and his headquarters were at the old station here in York, which lay just inside the walls. You can see the large arches where the tracks passed beneath, and also small remnants of part of the old station here where the bikes are kept. But this area is now known as Hudson Quarter. But it wasn't just that he brought railways to York. He quite literally controlled 1/3 of all railroads in Britain during the railway mania of the 1840s, a period where rail lines were just shooting up across the country following the success of the world's first inner-city railway line in 1830 between Liverpool and Manchester, also in the north of England. And of this railway mania, Hudson was at the heart of it all. And by the way, he did not hail from an established family. He was the 5th son of a farmer in the small village of Halsham near York. Both his parents had passed by the time he was 8, and he was forced to move to York at 15, working in a draper's shop here near the Minster. No doubt he was a successful businessman, but he also got lucky in that in 1927 he managed to somehow inherit a small fortune from his uncle. This wealth elevated his status and allowed him entry on the committee when the railways came. And soon later he was the Railway King. He was taking over smaller lines himself and even purchasing 12,000-acre country estates just to block competitors from building lines there. It was ferocious, brutal lawlessness. But there is a reason the railway mania is known as a bubble. Between the peak in 1845 and just 4 years later in 1849, railway share prices had dropped by 64%, as best known sources state. The optimism was drying out, costs were higher than expected, and revenues were lower than expected. A lot of companies and a lot of shareholders had lost a lot of money. One of these was Charlotte Bronte, and she wrote about it. She said, "Very many are, by the late strange railway system, deprived almost of their daily bread," end quote. This was because she, with her sisters, had invested their small inheritance into one of Hudson's rail lines and had been grave losers. But with the dramatic demise of the railway mania, the questions started, and there was nowhere for George Hudson to hide. Which brings us to another of York's landmarks. You see, one of Hudson's foremost ambitions was for there to be a bridge from his new railway to the other side of the banks of the River Ouse, towards the Minster. His argument was that it would be great for the prosperity of York. But one man in particular was adamantly against this idea. His name was George Leman, who argued the bridge served nothing but to deepen the pockets of Mr. Hudson. This George Leman now has a statue on Leman Road near the bridge, and I'm sure if you've been to York on the train, you'll have seen this statue as you leave the station. So this is very important. Right next to Hudson's old pride and joy at the old station, we have the statue of the man that ultimately defeated him, and the bridge that he always wanted, that ironically wasn't built until after his downfall. So this area of York is actually a reminder of the Battle of the Georges, you could say. As in 1849, York Council, led by Leman himself, were demanding money from Hudson, who had agreed to fund some of the design for this new bridge, Lendal Bridge. And here's where the cracks start to show. Hudson was struggling, he was drinking heavily, and with his companies failing, he was taking on high interest loans to stay afloat, ultimately spiralling into further debt. Those once loyal to him were starting to abandon ship, and the inquiries into his practices had begun. Soon after, many different entities were coming after Hudson, claiming he had acted unlawfully and demanding repayment from him, based on the accusations I stated at the very start of this video. He was forced to resign from nearly all of his directorships. He was actually replaced as chairman of the York, Newcastle and Railway Line by none other than George Lehman himself. Hudson, the man who York Civic Trust states was once the richest man in Britain at his peak, had been well and truly defeated after the burst of the railway mania bubble. He'd now sold all of his estates and his grand townhouse in Knightsbridge in London to cover his debts, but it still wasn't enough. However, it wasn't until 10 years after his downfall that he fled the continent, because he remained as MP for Sunderland until 1859, and at that time that gave him protection from imprisonment. But 7 years after fleeing, Hudson returned, as he believed he could win the election to become MP for Whitby, but he was arrested just before the election. Two of his biographers actually suggest George Lehman again was behind the arrests. But anyway, that brings us the full loop to where we started. Hudson was now in prison, but something much more tragic actually took place, and it has a potential connection to Charles Dickens. This incredible research is thanks to John Shaw from York Architectural and York Archaeological Society. So, you may remember I said Hudson worked as a draper when he came to York at 15 years old. Well, by the age of 21, he was actually married to the owner's sister, becoming a partner himself. The other owner was Richard Nicholson, so the firm became Nicholson and Hudson Drapers. Well, even beyond this business, throughout Hudson's following great ventures, he kept Nicholson as the treasurer for most of these ventures. He was the auditor of accounts for the York and North Midland Railway as well. They were very loyal to each other, but of course, by 1859, Nicholson was also being chased up for his role in the fraudulent schemes, and it was all too much for him. He was reportedly acting very strange for a few weeks, and then his body was found in the River Ouse near Lendal Bridge. He'd ended his misery at the age of 56. But it's in the trial of this death where it gets interesting and connects to Dickens. You see, there were witnesses who saw Nicholson acting odd near the river on that night. One of these witnesses was called Uriah Hesp, but it was printed in the press as Uriah Heep. Now, we know Dickens was a frequent visitor of York at the time, as his brother, Alfred Dickens, was an engineer on the railway here. Dickens' own favourite of his novels was David Copperfield, a book named David Copperfield. Now, the prime antagonist in this book was named Uriah Heep. The novel was serialised in the same year as Nicholson's death, so it's highly likely the inspiration came from this event. So, all sorts of connections here. But overall, George Hudson, let's evaluate. By the way, he never gained any power after his imprisonment, and he passed away quietly at his London flat in 1871. In numbers, he's one of the largest fraudsters in British history, but we must remember this was a completely different era. He was just the worst and the frontman of many others who acted unlawfully at the time. There were thousands of co-conspirators, most of whom turned on him, but the laissez-faire approach to regulation at a time when optimism was through the roof played a big part in this, and it spilled through into attitudes. Even after Hudson's fall, he had many supporters and friends, admirers in York and elsewhere across the country. Some of these actually paid for him to be released from prison. The reason the railway bubble collapsed was not necessarily due to fraudulent schemes. That just exacerbated the root cause of extreme over-optimism about this new technology, as we see in pretty much every bubble that has happened since. Also, although built on the basis of fraudulent schemes, thousands of miles of railway was built in this time, and 1,000 of that was by Hudson's enterprises. And this was very useful during the industrialisation of Britain, and it's a big moment in our country's history. So it wasn't all that bad, but for George, he remains infamously one of the largest fraudsters in British history.